Awesome. Cool. We can jump on it. Cool. So just a quick about me. This is kind of average hacker stuff. We just like to break things. That's the main thing we do, right? We break things, and from there, we work backwards. So today's session is just going to be a little bit of SQL injection. It's going to be on a learning platform, just so that we don't touch anyone's systems. There are legal issues if we do that kind of stuff. And I do generally avoid touching anyone's systems unless we do have a scope of work. And I'm sure you guys all know about those. Cool. So the first thing we worry about as penetration testers and security testers is discovery, right? A lot of companies don't know what is out there and what they expose. And that is one of the biggest risks. If you don't know something exists, how can you secure it? The other thing that we find is a lot of developers don't know exactly what is happening on the applications. They're there to make things work, and once it works, they move on. They've got a lot of work to do, and they're happy with that statement, right? So our first question is, what is out there, and how can I interact with it? So for today, we're just going to do an SQL injection. So we're going to take a look at a web application. I'm going to be doing a lot of alt-tabbing, so please excuse me. So I'm going to be testing on a nice little virtual application here that I'm running on my laptop called Damn Vulnerable Web Application. As it says, it's built to be vulnerable, and this is really good for an example for you guys, just to understand how we identify and the risks that are involved. So throughout this presentation, there are going to be some other vulnerabilities that come up. If you guys want to keep an eye out and see if you can spot those, that'd be awesome. If not, I'll show you guys at the end. Cool. Awesome. So obviously for this exercise, I'm just going to be going through something called SQL injection. So what is SQL injection? SQL injection is interacting with a database through means that shouldn't be allowed, right? So let me just go back to this. Cool. So the first thing we need to do is we need to identify input, right? If I can't interact with the system, I can't exploit the system. That is the main thing that an attacker looks for. If you can identify all of these within your organization, you can then protect them. But if you can't identify them, you can't protect this. So in this example, it's very simple. We've just got a user ID. Now, I can try a bunch of different things, and it's not stopping me from trying these things to try to see if I can identify the user. Sorry. Cool. So I'm just going to assume that we know a bit of information to save us some time here. And I know that the system works off of ID numbers, right? The numbers are built from 1 to 5. And with this, I can now see, okay, there's a different user. It returns the first name and last name of the user. Now, for those of you that are sharp enough, you've seen the first vulnerability right here, or the second vulnerability, right? You should never be using sequential numbers in a database. It's not a great idea. It allows me to then simply brute force different IDs and see the different users there, right? So through that, I've now identified my input. Now, I take a look at the information returned, because that is what I'm interested in. What information can I get out of this? Now, as you can see, it comes up with an ID, which is 1, and that's the user I tried to query, as well as the first name and last name of the user. So this would actually be the third vulnerability, right? There's a default user there. It's admin. People don't remove those from their databases. And often you find that those have default credentials, right? So in terms of our vision and how this looks to a hacker and how we look at this information, is we look at it in terms of the request itself. So this would be something called a proxy, where we'll intercept the traffic and then look at that, because it's a lot easier to replay and a lot easier to identify points of contact and what we can touch and play with, right? So in this, you can see at the top, it's got an ID, and the ID is 1, and we've got the submit option there. So that's really what I'm interested in. Now, for those of you that are sharp enough, you've seen another vulnerability here. We're using a get statement, which means that it's saved in your browser. Okay, so how this database works. Through this information that we've got as the output, I've been able to identify that there's 3 different fields. It's the ID, which is the number associated with the user, the admin, or the first name, and the surname, right? So in my mind, I build the database like this with 3 columns. I've got ID, first name, and last name. Now, the way a database works when you query it is it goes from top to bottom. And anytime it returns true on a query, it'll come back with that information for you. So if I can go, I know the first ID is 1, I'll get admin back. If I know the second ID is 2, I'll get Gordon Brown back, right? So this is how I'm building this attack in my mind. Now, what I want to do is I want to break this. That's the first step. I want to see something happen that the developers didn't intend. So for that to happen, I need to create an error. Now, there's a very common test string that we use. This should be detected by just about every WAF, but I'm going to use it for this. It's double, single, dash, dash, right? What this does is it breaks the SQL query by making it impossible to read and process on the back end. So when I hit this, you'll see I get a fatal error, right? Now with that, this is another vulnerability, but it allows me to now work backwards and understand how the query is working. The main thing I'm looking at here is how is the query breaking? Now, if we take a look here, we can see near line 1, there is a triple quotation happening, right? So it's not exiting the text properly, and it's therefore breaking the query because it doesn't know where it ends. So now that I know this, I can kind of build the query in my head. So in pseudocode, just making up the code as I talk, there's going to be where ID, which is the table or the column in the table, equals input, which is that input that I put in. That is the query that it uses, right? So it's going to say where the ID equals input, give me the output for that. Now, I can only control the input field, right? So that little section over there, which is input. And now I want to break this query. Now that I know this much information and the fact that I've got so much information from that error, it allows me to then build a working attack on this. So what I want, right, as I spoke about earlier, is I want the database or my queries to return true. Because if it's true, I get the information out and I get everything in the database. It's not just the one field like I was getting with the ID numbers. So how do I make everything true? Well, if I'm talking to you and I say, find the user where his ID is 1, or 1 equals 1, what's the answer to that? It's true in every case, because 1 always equals 1, right? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go into the website again, and we're going to try a different string. So it's a bit different to what I'm saying, just because there's a few more technical things with the quotation marks, but the steps are the same, right? It's very simple in terms of what we actually do. It's just getting to the stage that's difficult. So what I'm doing here is I'm saying where ID equals 1 or 1 equals 1, right? And now it's returning the entire database to me. So in this example, there's no real sensitive information. There's nothing that really seems destructive, right? But in reality, this would then dump your entire database. So if, for instance, it's a login database, you would then get a return of all the users, their email addresses in some cases, as well as passwords. And hopefully you have those hashed and salted so that it's not plain text. If it's plain text, I'll get a list of your usernames and passwords off of this, right? So I have my bonus round here. That's the examples I'm giving. What additional inputs did you guys see on that field or through that test? So if we go back, you'll see that there's actually a session ID and a security field here in the headers. These are things that developers don't necessarily take into account, right? It is an input. The server still processes this before it responds to me. So those are vulnerable to possible attack. Now, with developers, they don't normally get this view of how an attacker would be able to see the application and how it interacts with the server. But with this kind of view, they're able to see, well, there's these 2 other fields that I don't make use of, but the server still processes, right? So there's also insecure data transmission, right? That's using a GET request and saving that data in my browser's history. Hopefully there's nothing bad in my history tab. Right, you can see it's gone straight to this, and this is in my browser tab now, right? And it's actually showing the information I put in. So the percent 27 is just the single quotation mark, but it's actually reflecting the input I have. So this is adding additional risk to this kind of, or this application, because now anyone who accesses the user's browser can then retrieve that information, right? Awesome. How am I doing on time? Sorry. 20 minutes. Wow, I have a lot more time than I thought. Awesome. So the other issues, right, is how the database is created. As I spoke about earlier, when you create a database, you don't want to have sequential IDs or keys in the database, right? Because with that information, you can then guess it. It's very guessable, and you can just simply say ID 1, 2, 3, 4. And as an attacker, the first ID I always try is 1, because that's the default user. And that's normally an administrative user and allows me to get further into this. The other thing I'm sure you guys have all seen in your reports, I'm sure some of you have seen penetration test reports, is they're missing secure headers, right? This is simple stuff that developers do miss, but it can affect the application itself, right? So was anyone able to identify any other vulnerabilities on this? No. Okay, cool. Sorry, I rushed through this here. Do you guys have any questions at all? Yes.
The HTTP transmission, would that not maybe need to be an HTTPS so that it's secure, the first line?
Yes, it would. You're correct.
And I guess 1.1 is the TLS. Okay.
Yes. Awesome. Well done. So what I can do actually is just show you guys the tools that we use then. So when I'm attacking a web application, and to show you how easy this is, I'm going to show you a tool called Burp Suite. Right? This is a community edition Burp Suite. It's free. Anyone can download it and use it. So if you guys want to learn, test the stuff out yourself, you're more than welcome to. Just don't do it on anything public or anything that doesn't belong to you. Right? So what happens here is, as I submit requests through my browser, right, I will then see it in my proxy and stop it before it actually gets to the application. So I'm just going to turn that on, and we can just go and submit. Is it the wrong browser? Cool. So you'll see the request there, and that's actually blocked and stopped halfway through the transmission, right? So if I submit again, sorry, let me close this browser. I did think I had it open. Cool, so what we'll see here is we actually see it as a request here, right? This is a view I wish more developers did have, as most developers don't get to see this throughout their careers, right? Most developers don't get to see the actual information that's transmitted or understand how an HTTP request works. So what we would do as an attacker then is we can do something called brute forcing, right? So I can send this to a nice little tab here, and it allows me to repeat the request. So by simply changing the ID again, I can simply repeat that request and get different output. Now, not available in the free version, but in the paid versions, is a nice tool called Intruder. It allows me to do something very similar, except it takes this process and it automates it for me, right? Which is why you're seeing attackers and brute force is happening more and more, and why it takes so little time for people to get this right. Right? I can simply mark an ID like so, and I can simply add a list of different things I want to try, right? So that's my single double double. I want to try the numbers, and I want to try a username. Now, to get a view of the output I get, you'll see how quick that was and how easy that was, right? As an attacker, I'd be looking at the responses from this, right? At a glance, I'm able to identify what string is affecting the server and how I'm able to exploit this. So just by looking at the response length, I can see that the first request, which is the quotation marks, is giving me a response which is not even half the size, right? And the reason for that is it's giving me the error message, which we then used to build the attack, right? If I take a look at the other types or requests that I sent with the numbers and different usernames, I'm not seeing anything interesting as an attacker there, right? So it's that simple to identify SQL injection on applications nowadays. Now, these days, a lot of this is stopped by something called a WAF. By placing your server behind a WAF, you can detect these types of attacks. And that should be setting off your alerts and getting your teams to start responding on this. Now, in terms of real-world risk of SQL injection, it starts becoming a bit more complicated, right? You can see information being disclosed in terms of your users, or papier information, as the guys talked about earlier, where you actually have fines on that, as well as information about your infrastructure and getting access to your infrastructure itself. So you can actually build an SQL injection attack into something called code execution, which you can then use to get a reverse shell. So I haven't prepared that for today, unfortunately, but it is a very cool thing to think about, right? As an attacker, just a simple SQL injection like this can get you into a system or into a network behind their firewall. Awesome. So is there any more questions? No? Cool. I'm done. Let me...
Round of applause.